The man who built the walls had forgotten his family built the door. Stephen Miller did not walk into hearing room 2154. He entered as a manifestation of the executive branch's absolute authority. An architect of deterrence policy whose very existence was a historical contradiction. This was the man who had perfected the art of the bureaucratic paradox, ordering the deportation of 3,000 individuals daily while simultaneously laying claim to the moral high ground of refugee ancestry. For Miller, the American dream was a finite resource, one perfectly consumed by his great-grandparents, leaving only the dregs and the barred entrance for everyone else. The national motto, in his view, had been effectively revised. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, but only up to 1903. This confrontation was the inevitable destination of 3 ignored subpoenas, dodged with an increasingly farcical list of excuses that culminated, infamously, in a critical dental appointment. Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor, chose the integrity of his mandibular ridge over explaining the fate of the 648 children still scattered across the country. Ghosts in a system designed for maximum cruelty and minimal accountability. The political gravity of the moment was immense. The atmosphere inside the Rayburn building dense with expectation. Miller, flanked by White House counsel as immaculately polished as he was, projected an aura of contemptuous serenity. His navy suit, his Hermes silk, the smooth, reflective dome of his head, every detail communicated untouchable power. His placement of the water glass, precisely 2 inches from the microphone, was a microaggression of control, a small message to the room that only his order mattered. Across the witness table sat the catalyst of his discomfort, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The former criminal defense attorney from Dallas did not bother with the props of performance. She brought only her lethal reputation and a slim, leather folder containing what she knew would be the fatal truth. Chairman Jamie Rasson's opening statement, focused on the intersection of immigration policy and extremist influence, served merely as the starting gun for the intellectual duel. When the gavel dropped and the oath was administered, Miller offered a practiced nod of acknowledgement, the gesture of a man who believed the truth was a flexible concept, entirely subject to political utility. Congresswoman Crockett, you have 30 minutes. Crockett's first motion was one of supreme confidence. She leaned into the microphone. Not aggressively, but as a predator settling in for a long, necessary meal. Her Texas drawl was deliberate, melodic, and entirely deceptive. She bypassed the policy debates entirely, opting for an immediate, personal strike. Mr. Miller, I've read the policy memos, the DHS directives. I know what you've built. Now, I want to know who built you. Let's talk about Wolf Lieb Glosser. Miller, prepared for the policy minefield, was blindsided by the sudden shift to ancestral history. He relaxed his guard fractionally, delivering the boilerplate narrative of the self-made immigrant family from Belarus, arriving in the early 1900s to pursue the American dream. Crockett's smile was immediate and utterly predatory. A wonderful story of opportunity. 1903. Tell the committee, Mr. Miller, exactly how Wolf Lieb, your great-great-grandfather, would qualify under the merit-based, English proficient, self-sufficient system you have spent your entire career constructing. The air in the room instantly chilled. Miller's lawyer shifted, sensing the trap. Miller attempted to pivot, stating his family's story was a matter of legal history, not policy hypotheticals. History is not hypothetical, Mr. Miller. It is precedent, Crockett countered, producing the 1910 census record. Here is your great-grandmother, Bessie, under the column, English spoken, the official, indelible record states number. Here is the testimonial from your uncle, Dr. David S. Glosser, outlining the family's capital, $8. She laid both documents down, side by side, creating an undeniable visual ledger of poverty and desperation, the very criteria Miller now sought to outlaw. $8 and not one word of English. A family fleeing state-sponsored violence. Crockett summarized, her voice gaining the authority of a judge delivering a life sentence. Under the policies you advocate for, the elimination of chain migration, the wealth tests, the language requirements, your ancestor would have been labeled an undesirable public charge. He would have been rejected at Ellis Island, deported back to the Russian Empire, and, as your own uncle testified, subsequently murdered by the Nazis. The very notion of Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff, is an artifact of the exact policy leniency you despise. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, holding the full weight of the historical irony. The simple truth, sir, is that you are sitting here today only because America did not apply your rules to your people. The door was open for the Glosser family, and yet, you have dedicated your life to welding it shut for everyone else. I ask you, when does the debt of gratitude expire? At what point did your family's history of survival become irrelevant to your policy of extinction? The question hung heavy, demanding a philosophical and moral answer that Miller was clearly unequipped, or unwilling, to provide. Miller's response to the direct historical and moral challenge was the predictable defense of a man whose career was built on semantic evasion. He dismissed the historical narrative as an irrelevant distraction, asserting that his family had followed the legal path, a concept he insisted was absolute and immutable, existing outside the fluidity of historical context. He claimed their journey was one of adherence to the proper channels, entirely separate from the chaotic reality of contemporary migration. Congresswoman Crockett countered this claim of legal purity with devastating factual precision. She pointed out that in 1903, the channels Wolff-Lieb-Glosser utilized were essentially frictionless: a walk off a boat, a perfunctory inspection at Ellis Island, and the almost immediate issuance of a new identity, so swift, in fact, that his name was transcribed incorrectly, forever altering his family lineage. There was no contemporary visa queue, no crushing merit-based point system, no English language competency exam, and certainly no wealth test strict enough to exclude an arrival with a mere $8. She painted a vivid picture of the modern glosser, trapped in a 5-year line, rejected for public charge risk, doomed to expire in bureaucratic limbo due to the very system Miller himself had constructed to ensure eternal waiting. The profound irony was that the legality Miller championed was simply the good fortune of arriving when the law was inherently generous, a historical privilege he was determined to eradicate for others. Crockett then escalated the indictment, highlighting the concept Miller derided most vehemently: chain migration. She laid out the factual sequence. Wolff-Lieb secured passage, saved money, and subsequently sponsored his wife, his children, and his brother, one by one. The precise definition of family reunification, the Glosser lineage, the very foundation of Stephen Miller's existence, was a direct beneficiary of the policy he now branded a disaster and worked tirelessly to dismantle. The Congresswoman offered a stark observation: the Glosser family's success was not proof of Miller's policies, but the direct result of their absence. He had spent his adult life pulling the ladder up, convinced in his own delusion that he was the one who had built the entire edifice, when in fact, his great-great-grandfather had built it with the foundation of $8 and zero English. The confrontation shifted abruptly from family origins to intellectual formation. Crockett inquired about Miller's educational career at Duke University, not for academic achievements, but for ideological mentorship. She asked about the influence of Richard Spencer, a name that landed in the hushed room like the detonation of a tactical weapon. Miller's practiced composure faltered, his facial muscles freezing into a mask of studied non-recognition. He offered the standard, pre-approved disavowal, claiming awareness of Spencer but publicly condemning his actions. Crockett dismissed the attempted pivot. She held aloft a printout detailing a 2016 Mother Jones article, which quoted Spencer, the man who would become the founder of the modern alt-right movement and organizer of the infamous Charlottesville rally, describing Miller as a close associate. someone he knew very well, and to whom he acted as a mentor. The weight of the word mentor hung in the air. The man who popularized the chant, "Jews will not replace us," claimed to have guided the worldview of the Deputy Chief of Staff. The Congresswoman proceeded to systematically dismantle Miller's denial of association. She presented contemporaneous records from the Duke Conservative Union, confirming not merely overlapping membership, but collaboration. Both attended the same meetings, worked together on a 2007 immigration debate, and co-organized the controversial Islamofascism Awareness Week, sponsored by David Horowitz. She then fanned out multiple event photographs on the witness table, graphic evidence showing Miller and Spencer in the same rooms, at the same events, on multiple occasions, undercutting the claim of having merely crossed paths. Crockett pressed the point. Condemnation of Richard Spencer, after his public toxicity became undeniable, was a low bar, one that even David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, had cleared. Miller's belated disavowal was cast not as a moral awakening, but a cynical political calculation, a move made only after the ideology he had embraced became too damaging to acknowledge. The investigation then spiraled back into Miller's adolescent history, seeking the earliest evidence of ideological commitment. Crockett produced a report detailing an interview with Jason Isis, a childhood friend of Miller's from middle school, a relationship forged over a shared love of Star Trek. The Congresswoman described the chilling, documented ending of that friendship the summer before high school, when Miller, at the age of 14, allegedly terminated the relationship with the blunt explanation that he could no longer associate with ISIS because he was Latino. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Crockett's summary was merciless. Miller's denial of white nationalism was rendered irrelevant by the factual pattern. His claimed mentor was a white nationalist ideologue. His campus events were adjacent to white nationalist organizing. The sources he would later champion were white nationalist publications. And at 14, he had already implemented a personal racial litmus test for his closest friendships. The conclusion was left unspoken but visually and logically inescapable. If the behavior mirrored the ideology, the public could draw its own conclusions. The narrative then transitioned to Miller's student writings, the intellectual seeds of his later policies. Crockett detailed excerpts from his Duke newspaper column, Miller Time. She read aloud his dismissive contempt for multiculturalism, which he had categorized as segregation by another name. She highlighted his cold economic assertion regarding the gender wage gap, that women earned less because they deserved less, based on the pure efficiency demands of successful business owners. His arrogant disdain for the working class was also documented, including a high school opinion piece, the sentiment of which carried into his Duke years, where he complained bitterly about being asked to pick up his own trash when plenty of janitors who are paid to do it for us were available. These pieces established a pattern of elitism, contempt for labor, and disdain for equality that predated his political career. The Congresswoman concluded that Miller's journey, from the liberal environment of Santa Monica to the elite halls of Duke, was not one of education, but of radicalization, one that occurred not in the dark corners of the internet, but in the expensive, well-lit seminar rooms of an elite institution. The ultimate piece of evidence was then introduced. Crockett lifted a stack of papers, 4 inches thick, secured with heavy tabs, and dropped it onto the desk. The resonant thud echoed, a physical manifestation of the damning evidence. 900 emails, she announced. This was the printout of Miller's correspondence with Breitbart news editors between 2015 and 2016. Emails leaked by the former editor, Katie McHugh, who had since renounced the far right and cooperated with investigators, a painful act of moral reckoning that Miller, by contrast, had evaded entirely. Crockett began the methodical, destructive reading. The Red Tab email from September 6, 2015, recommended The Camp of the Saints, a French novel considered a foundational text by neo-Nazis worldwide. which depicted immigrants as subhuman invaders engaged in the destruction of Western civilization. The Blue Tab email from October 23, 2015, shared a link to the white nationalist website BDARE, explicitly named after the first white child born in the Americas, a choice designed to emphasize white identity. The Yellow Tab referenced Ameren, American Renaissance, by its insider nickname, a publication of Jared Taylor, known for promoting the pseudoscientific genetic inferiority of black people. Miller was revealed not merely as a reader, but as an informed, active participant in the circulation of these texts. The Southern Poverty Law Center's, SPLC, analysis of the 900 emails was then introduced. The SPLC report stated an inability to locate a single instance of Miller writing in a sympathetic or even neutral tone about any non-white or foreign-born individual. Crockett presented this as more than mere bias. It was a statistical impossibility. She mocked a calculation on an imaginary calculator, the mathematical odds of writing 900 emails on immigration over 2 years, and having every single one be negative towards people of color, were effectively zero, an outcome achievable only through deliberate, systematic bias. This was no longer a matter of opinion or policy preference. It was mathematical proof of a systematic agenda. Further, gems from the correspondence were unveiled. Miller had persistently pushed narratives linking immigrants to violent crime, deliberately ignoring or dismissing FBI data that proved immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens, prioritizing narrative over verified fact. Most damningly, following the racially motivated murder of 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, Miller's primary concern, as expressed in a Purple Tab email, was not the mass murder but the cultural purge, represented by the potential removal of Confederate monuments. 9 people dead, and Miller's focus was on statues. The final indictment of his correspondence involved the circulation of content from InfoWars, Alex Jones's toxicity platform, a source deemed so dangerous it was banned by every major platform. Yet Miller had channeled its conspiracy-laden material to Breitbart reporters as source material, ensuring the poison reached millions. Miller attempted to regain control by attacking the messenger, labeling the SPLC a discredited organization. Crockett seized on the defense immediately, agreeing that the organization could be attacked, but pointing out that the source was Katie McHugh, an internal witness who had sacrificed her career and political alignment to admit her error and provide the evidence. She had shown moral growth and cooperation, while Miller had been rewarded with a promotion to Deputy Chief of Staff. His credibility was not merely wounded, it was structurally compromised by the testimony of his former allies. The words were no longer just emails, they were the blueprints for action. The Congresswoman closed the email folder with a heavy finality, ready to move on to the consequences of those words. The subject of the next phase of the hearing was the children. The atmosphere in Hearing Room 2154 had transitioned from tense legal debate to moral reckoning. Congresswoman Crockett had successfully established Stephen Miller's personal history as a profound contradiction to his policy agenda. Now, she moved to the core indictment, the human cost of his ideology, represented by the children. Crockett walked to a meticulously prepared easel beside the dais. On it rested a single, agonizing image, a young child, no older than 5, trapped behind chain-link caging inside a stark, institutional facility. The child's face was visible, the eyes red and swollen from prolonged, inconsolable grief. She did not describe the photo. She merely let the audience and the cameras absorb the raw reality of Miller's policy. Mr. Miller, Crockett's voice was devoid of the earlier Texas warmth, now possessing the chilling clarity of a witness standing over a crime scene. You call these facilities many names: family residential centers. My personal favorite, deterrence facilities, because nothing, absolutely nothing, encapsulates American values quite like using the profound, psychological anguish of crying children as a political tool to discourage asylum seekers. She pulled a document from her folder, detailing reports from NBC News which confirmed Miller's personal role. The report cited multiple sources affirming that Miller viewed family separation not as a regrettable side effect, but as a deliberate, indispensable tool for maximum deterrence. In May 2018, Miller had convened a meeting of senior White House principals, including the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, to formalize the zero-tolerance policy. Miller, according to officials present, framed the matter in apocalyptic terms, claiming that without extreme enforcement, it is the end of our country as we know it. Crockett then delivered the most chilling detail of the meeting. Miller called for a show of hands. The policy decision to tear children from their mothers was treated with the casual bureaucratic disregard of ordering lunch. A sea of hands, the document confirmed, rose in support of the measure. A conscious, documented, cabinet-level vote to inflict state-sponsored trauma. A sea of hands, Crockett repeated, letting the phrase hang in the silence. For tearing children from their parents, as though you were deciding which color lanyard to wear. The results of that vote were now indelible history. Approximately 3,000 children separated from their parents under the policy. The trauma was immediate and profound. Crockett cited the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, own Inspector General, who confirmed the policy caused intense trauma and long-term psychological damage. The most damning figure, however, was the continuing absence. 648 children, according to the most recent federal accounting, remained missing, still unreunited with their parents. Do you know where those 648 children are? Mr. Miller? Crockett's question was a demand, not an inquiry. Do you maintain a file? A tracking system? Or are they simply statistical casualties? The necessary collateral damage required to achieve your deterrence metrics? Miller's lawyer attempted to interject, citing the administrative complexity of tracking every case. Crockett cut him off with a force that surprised the room. She was not interested in excuses for administrative failure. She was prosecuting the intentional design of the failure. There was no system for reunification because, she argued, reunification was never the goal. A tracking system would undermine the deterrent effect. The chaos, the missing children, the lost files, was the feature, not the bug. She then read verbatim from the testimony of a detention facility social worker. A 6-year-old girl stopped speaking after she was separated from her mother. For 2 weeks, she didn't utter a single word. Staff feared she was mute. She was not. She simply had nothing left to say after the only person she wanted to talk to had been taken away. The Congresswoman followed this testimony with another devastating account. A 3-year-old boy, separated from his father for 87 days. When finally returned, the father reported that the child did not recognize him. 87 days. A lifetime in the memory of a toddler. The boy had forgotten his father's face because of a policy born of Miller's calculated cruelty. The systemic failure to track was the true indictment. When a federal judge later ordered the families reunited, the administration was forced to admit they had no idea where many children were. They had separated them and then lost track. This was not an oversight. Crockett stated, it was the desired outcome. You cannot scare people into staying home if you plan to put the families back together quickly. The separation itself had to be permanent, terrifying, and irreversible to function as the deterrent Miller intended. But the ambition did not stop there. Crockett revealed the policy that was never fully implemented. The dark ceiling of Miller's intent. Citing multiple former officials, she stated that Miller had sought to mandate the separation of all immigrant families, including those who arrived legally at ports of entry seeking asylum. This proposal would have resulted in the separation of 25,000 more children. The only thing that prevented this catastrophic expansion, she noted, was not a moral or legal objection from within the administration, but a pure logistical concern. DHS advised that the system would simply collapse under the sheer volume of children. Logistics. she concluded, was the only thin barrier standing between Miller and 25,000 more separated children. Crockett returned to the theme of family legacy, drawing the threads of her narrative tight. She contrasted the flight of Miller's great-grandparents, who endured an ocean voyage with $8 to keep their family unit intact, with Miller's action. Your great-grandparents fled so their family would not be torn apart, she stated, her voice trembling slightly with contained fury. They built a life on keeping their family whole. And you, their great-grandson, sat in a White House meeting, and you raised your hand to tear apart other families. By a show of hands. The historical dissonance was complete. The Congresswoman then introduced the final, stinging evidence of the policy's impact, moving beyond the children to the agents tasked with carrying out Miller's vision. She produced a quote from a DHS official, who spoke anonymously to NBC News. The official described the agency's internal environment. The agency has become, and I quote, Stephen Miller's personal laboratory for hate. That is not my characterization, Mr. Miller, Crockett stated, her eyes locking onto his. That is the assessment of someone inside your own department, a public servant who has seen the inner workings of the machine you built. The policy, she concluded, was not immigration enforcement, it was the construction of a mechanism for mass repression. A machine that could arrest, detain, and deport 1 million people a year, stripped of habeas corpus and protected by judicial review. Once this infrastructure of fear was built, once the detention centers, the mass deportation quotas, and the legal frameworks for stripping rights were in place, it would not simply disappear. Today, it was aimed at immigrants. Tomorrow, she warned, the machine could be turned on anyone the government deemed undesirable. That, she stated, was not democracy. Having established the moral cost and ideological foundation of Miller's work, Congresswoman Crockett moved to the infrastructure of his continued power, his activities outside government and the systemic corruption he had built into the executive branch. She noted that upon his brief departure from the White House in 2021, Miller had not retired to quiet contemplation. He had immediately launched a nonprofit organization, the America First Legal Foundation, AFL. The branding was intentionally deceptive. Miller had dubbed it the conservative ACLU, a comparison Crockett immediately seized upon with sardonic clarity. The ACLU defends civil rights, AFL, she pointed out, primarily existed to sue federal agencies and corporations to block relief and dismantle civil rights protections for minorities. The brand, she stated, was catchy, but the substance was precisely inverted. Crockett meticulously detailed AFL's aggressive legal accomplishments. The organization sued to block $4 billion in debt relief intended for minority farmers who had faced decades of systematic discrimination in federal lending. AFL was victorious, and the farmers lost their relief. They sued to halt the Keeping Families Together program, which offered protection from deportation to undocumented spouses of American citizens. Again, AFL won, condemning thousands of families to the fear of separation. Further lawsuits targeted corporate diversity initiatives. Miller's organization sued Nike and Mattel, claiming discrimination against white males and opposing the promotion of LGBTQ+ narratives. This was not charitable work, Crockett observed. This was a $27 million, donor-funded legal machine dedicated to ensuring that historically marginalized groups were not allowed to make progress. The source of the funding then came under scrutiny. AFL, Crockett revealed, received over $27 million from the Bradley Impact Fund, a dark money network funneling vast sums to conservative causes. The organization's core function was simple: utilizing seven-figure funding to file lawsuits that perpetuated the narrative that white people were the real victims of discrimination in modern America. They sued medical schools over diversity in admissions. They sued the administration over student loan relief, arguing it discriminated against those who had already paid their debts. It was a career built on reversing the historical reality of victimhood. The indictment then shifted to the more insidious and complex issue of conflict of interest. Crockett produced an organizational chart, visually connecting Miller's governmental role with his outside entity. Miller was currently serving as Deputy Chief of Staff and Homeland Security Advisor, a policymaker within the federal government. Yet, the chart showed him simultaneously retaining the title of President of America First Legal, an organization whose express purpose was to sue the federal government. The intertwining of power deepened. Crockett pointed to other boxes on the chart. Gene Hamilton, AFL's co-founder, was now senior counsel at the White House, working in the same executive office building as Miller. Reed Rubenstein, AFL's senior vice president, had been nominated for a key legal advisory role at the State Department. Let the record show the facts, Crockett summarized, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. Mr. Miller founded an organization that sues the government. He then rejoined the government. His organization continues to sue the government, and he has systematically staffed the government with his co-founders. She leaned back, the question rhetorical but devastating. In any other industry, in the legal profession, in business, this setup is called a conflict of interest. In a courtroom, I would file for an immediate recusal. But here in Washington, this is apparently labeled public service. Crockett charged that the only difference between Miller and a sophisticated con artist was the latter at least attempted to conceal the paper trail. The conspiracy was laid bare. Miller had written the playbook outside of government, AFL, Project 2025, joined the government to implement it, and ensured his external organization continued to sue the government to accelerate the implementation. She then introduced a final, chilling connection. America First Legal was a key member of the advisory board for Project 2025, the conservative blueprint detailing the systemic dismantling of the federal government, mass firings of civil servants, and the consolidation of executive power. Miller's organization had helped draft the architectural plans that he was now implementing from the inside. Miller's lawyer, attempting to staunch the bleeding, finally spoke up, offering a weak defense about appropriate ethics guidelines. Crockett dismissed the intervention instantly. Ethics guidelines are for people who respect ethics. Counsel, the question here is not about a paper violation. It is about the deliberate construction of a legal machine designed to erode the very civil rights your own family needed to survive. The pivot back to Miller's current, active policies was seamless. I am not interested in your past ethics. I am interested in what you are doing right now with this compromised power, Crockett stated, preparing to unveil the final, most draconian policies of the new regime. She began with a seemingly simple question, a challenge of pure arithmetic. Mr. Miller, a math question, 3,000 multiplied by 365. What is the product? Silence from the witness table. The answer is 1,095,000. Crockett provided. That, Mr. Miller, is the number of human beings you are demanding be arrested annually. 1 million people per year. She produced a recent Axios report confirming that Miller and the Secretary of Homeland Security had established an aggressive, unannounced quota for ICE arrests, 3,000 per day. A rate triple that of the previous administration. This daily quota was the equivalent of arresting the entire population of a small American town every 24 hours. Miller attempted to deflect, offering the familiar assertion that enforcing immigration law was a fundamental duty. I am not finished, Crockett declared, holding up her hand, stopping his deflection mid-sentence. The policy was not just about arrests, it was about the destruction of due process. Crockett revealed the policy being actively considered by Miller's inner circle, the suspension of habeas corpus for immigrants. She emphasized the profound historical gravity of the right to challenge unlawful detention. A cornerstone of English common law since 1215, the suspension of habeas corpus had historically been reserved for true existential crises. Lincoln during the Civil War, FDR during World War II. You are comparing a mother seeking asylum Mr. Miller, to the Confederate Army, you are comparing a farm worker to the existential threat of Pearl Harbor. Crockett stated with controlled fury, either your delusions of grandeur require professional attention, or you genuinely believe that a grandmother selling tamales is a greater threat to the Republic than the suspension of 800 years of legal tradition. The disregard for the judiciary followed. Crockett documented instances where courts had ordered deportation flights to El Salvador halted, and Miller had personally and unilaterally ordered them to continue. In the infamous Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, when the Department of Justice conceded that a deportation was an administrative error, Miller had publicly contradicted his own Justice Department, insisting it was intentional. You are not enforcing the law, Mr. Miller, Crockett concluded. You are positioning yourself above it. The courts say stop. You say go. Your own department says mistake. You say intentional. She then read from a final, explosive document, an internal assessment from a DHS official who spoke to NBC News. The official stated that ICE officers were now being ordered to arrest anyone they merely suspected of being undocumented, not just those with criminal records or standing deportation orders, but anyone. A father driving to work, a teenager going to church, a grandmother on her way to school. This official described the agency's internal mandate, again using the devastating quote, "The agency has become," and I quote, "Stephen Miller's personal laboratory for hate. 1 million arrests per year. No due process. Judges ignored, and a department official calling it a laboratory for hate." Crockett summarized, "This is not immigration enforcement. This is the final stage of building a machine, an infrastructure for mass arrests, mass detention, and mass deportation without judicial review. And once you build that machine, Mr. Miller, it can be pointed at anyone. Today, it is immigrants. Tomorrow, it is anyone who opposes the architecture you designed." Congresswoman Crockett, having surgically dismantled Miller's policy, ideology, and organizational conflicts, executed the final maneuver of her indictment. The atmosphere in the hearing room was thick, heavy with the weight of the evidence, 900 emails, the $27 million legal machine, the 1 million annual arrests, and the damning figure of 648 lost children. Miller remained stone-faced, his physical stillness a desperate, final attempt to project control over an utterly chaotic reality. Crockett set aside the policy folders, her hands empty for the first time in nearly 2 hours. She returned to the origin of the conflict, the single point that transcended law and politics: family. "I have reserved my most important question for last," Crockett stated, her voice quiet but carrying the authority of final judgment. "I want to return to where we began. Mr. Miller, your family." She did not ask about Wolf Lieb-Glosser's money or his language skills this time. She spoke directly about the letter written by his own uncle, Dr. David S. Glosser. This was the passage Miller had likely read but chosen to forget. The ultimate family betrayal. Crockett recited the words from memory, slowly, deliberately, her voice filling the silence. "I would encourage Stephen to ask himself if the chanting, torch-bearing Nazis of Charlottesville, whose support his boss seems to court so cavalierly, do not envision a similar fate for him." The words landed with the weight of historical prophecy. The ideological alliance Miller had cultivated, the white nationalist publications he had endorsed, the "Jews will not replace us" chant organized by his alleged mentor, Richard Spencer, all were turned back on Miller himself. "Do you understand what your uncle is saying, Mr. Miller?" Crockett asked, the question less about comprehension and more about conscience. "The very people whose toxic ideology you have spent your career amplifying, the VDARE crowd, the Camp of the Saints readership, if they achieved their ethno-state. Do you believe they would welcome you? Or do you believe they would use the very infrastructure you are currently building against you?" Crockett stood, slowly emerging from behind the dais. Miller's Jewish ancestry, his family's flight from state-sponsored pogroms and the shadow of the Holocaust. became the central focus. She charged that Miller was actively providing intellectual cover, building the systemic framework of mass arrests, detention networks, and legal mechanisms to strip rights, alongside groups that, given enough power, would turn their focus upon him in an instant. She walked toward the witness table, closing the physical distance, making the confrontation intensely personal. Your uncle saw this hypocrisy. He saw you sharpening knives for the people who would happily plunge them into your own neck. Miller's lawyer lunged forward, desperately attempting to stop the line of questioning. Citing its prejudicial nature, Crockett cut through the intervention, her voice dropping to a near whisper, almost gentle in its intensity. My final question, Mr. Miller, is the simplest of all, she said, looking directly into his eyes. Have you ever read your uncle's entire letter? From beginning to end, every word? Silence. Miller's gaze remained flat, unreadable, an attempt to maintain a facade of intellectual superiority. And if you have, Crockett continued, pressing the ultimate psychological vulnerability, did you feel anything? Still, absolute silence, not policy, not a talking point, but an unanswerable question about basic human emotion and family legacy. Miller glanced frantically at his lawyer, who whispered an urgent, unrecorded instruction. Then, in a spontaneous act of self-preservation that betrayed every calculated move he had made that day, Miller did the unthinkable. He stood up. This hearing is a circus, Miller declared, his voice tight with barely contained fury and panic. I refuse to continue participating in this political theater. He unclipped the microphone, placing it with a deliberate, performative neatness on the table, a final, absurd attempt at maintaining order as his world collapsed. Chairman Rassin began to call the hearing to order, but Miller was already moving, walking past his two lawyers, past the witness table, toward the double doors of the hearing room. Crockett did not raise her voice. She did not give chase. Her words, clear and calm, were captured by every boom microphone, echoing louder than any shout. Mr. Miller, she called out, pausing his flight. His hand was on the door handle. Your great-grandparents fled persecution with $8 and never ran again. They stayed, they built, they faced whatever came. That is how your family survived. Miller did not turn around. You, with all your power, all your privilege, all the protection of the White House, you cannot even sit in a chair and answer one question about your own family. Running away, Mr. Miller, Crockett finished, her voice laced with final contempt. That is your real legacy. Miller pushed through the door. It swung shut behind him with a decisive thwack. The hearing room instantly erupted into gasps, the frantic chatter of reporters, and the relentless clicking of cameras. Crockett turned to face the cameras directly, her expression utterly composed. Let the record show that the witness has left the hearing without being excused. She paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to settle, and let the record show that when asked whether he felt anything reading his own uncle's words, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy of the United States chose to run. The video clip of the walkout did not merely go viral, it detonated across the digital landscape like a political nuclear bomb. Within the first 90 minutes, the moment Miller's hand touched the door handle had been viewed 45 million times. By the close of the day, it had surpassed 80 million, obliterating every standing record for a congressional hearing clip. The 3 seconds of Miller's flight became the most replayed footage in C-SPAN history. The phrase, Miller runs, trended #1 worldwide for 72 consecutive hours, eclipsing global phenomena like major sporting events, blockbuster movie trailers, and even major geopolitical events. Social media platforms, particularly Twitter, experienced measurable server slowdowns under the strain of the relentless traffic. The reaction was a merciless, global cascade of ridicule. TikTok creators set the walkout to every conceivable soundtrack, from anthems of flight to the tragically comedic simplicity of the sound of silence. The memes were brutal in their immediacy and precision. Miller was photoshopped running from the ghosts of the 648 children, fleeing a simple calculator, escaping his own uncle's tearful letter, and sprinting away from a historical depiction of Ellis Island. Someone quickly developed a "Where in the world is Stephen Miller's conscience?" game. The most effective meme, however, was simple and devastating. A split-screen image. On the left, a sepia-toned photograph of Wolf Lieb Glosser arriving in 1903. Captioned, "Ran toward America with $8 and no English." On the right, a high-definition freeze frame of Stephen Miller pushing through the hearing room door in 2025. Captioned, "Ran from a simple question about it with $27 million in dark money." This image alone garnered over 60 million views. The mainstream media could not contain the narrative. CNN's post-hearing analysis was unsparing, with veterans expressing stunned disbelief. One anchor stated that in decades of covering Washington, they had never witnessed a senior White House official simply abandon their sworn duty and physically flee a direct question about their own family's survival. Another devoted an entire hour to the psychological fallout, featuring a body language expert who analyzed Miller's hand movements as he stood, diagnosing the moment as a classic flight response, driven by an inability to physically articulate a defense, rather than simple anger. Even Fox News struggled to maintain the spin, while one pundit attempted to label the event ambush journalism and Democrat theatrics. Their own legal analyst, when pressed, conceded the fundamental truth. The Congresswoman asked, "Did you read the letter? And did you feel anything?" That, the analyst admitted, was not a "gotcha" question. It was a fundamental inquiry that any functional human being should be prepared to answer. The international response magnified the humiliation. The BBC ran it as a lead story. Trump official flees hearing when asked about family. Der Spiegel's headline declared, "The man who deports families cannot face his own." The consensus was unified. Miller's run was a tacit admission of the irreconcilable moral debt he owed to his family's history. The polling collapse was immediate and catastrophic. Miller's personal favorability, already a meager 34%, cratered to 19% within the week. Among crucial independents, his approval fell to a devastating 12%. Even within his own Republican base, support dropped into the high 40s. The figure 648 became an inescapable rallying cry. Protesters outside the White House brandished signs, 648 children. 0 answers. 1 coward. The political consequences were swift and devastating. Republican senators, sensing the toxicity, began to immediately distance themselves. One prominent senator called the walkout deeply troubling, while another expressed concerns about Mr. Miller's temperament. Even the most hard-line conservative figures, such as Ted Cruz, offered only terse, non-committal statements, suggesting that all public servants should be prepared to answer questions about their record, a subtle but profound public rebuke. Within the first week, 3 Republican House members from vulnerable swing districts publicly called for Miller's resignation. The White House entered full damage control mode. Miller was instantly pulled from all public appearances. Scheduled high-profile interviews were indefinitely postponed. The source of the administration's fury was not Miller's policies, but the weakness his flight had projected. The policy architecture began to crumble. The notorious 3.000 per day arrest quota was quietly paused for review within 10 days of the hearing. Anonymous ICE officials admitted that the walkout had politically neutralized aggressive enforcement. "We cannot be the face of a policy," one official stated, when the architect literally ran away from defending it. The proposal to suspend habeas corpus, once championed by Miller, was declared dead on arrival in the Senate, with Republican aides refusing to touch a proposal linked to a figure so politically toxic. Miller's supposedly independent legal organization, America First Legal, AFL, faced immediate, existential scrutiny. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, announced a full-scale investigation into the conflicts of interest raised by Crockett within 72 hours. Major law firms that had partnered with AFL quietly withdrew from joint cases. Most critically, the Bradley Impact Fund, AFL's largest funder, initiated a formal review of its financial relationship. 2 weeks after the walkout, Gene Hamilton, Miller's co-founder and White House senior counsel, resigned. The official reason was family obligations. The actual reason, according to inside sources, was a desperate attempt to avoid going down with the ship. The long-languishing House resolution demanding all documents related to the family separation policy, specifically naming Miller, was suddenly fast-tracked. It passed by a significant margin just 4 days after the hearing, with 12 Republicans crossing the aisle, proving that the political cost of defending Miller had become unacceptably high. The collateral damage was immediate and personal. Miller's uncle, Dr. David S. Glosser, became the most sought-after interview subject in America, appearing on every major network, including, most devastatingly, Fox News Sunday. In every appearance, his message was consistent. I watched my nephew run from a question about whether he read my letter. I have my answer now. He read it. He just doesn't care. On one network, the retired neuropsychologist broke down completely, his tears streaming as he stated the truth he had hoped to avoid. I wrote that letter hoping something would reach him, that he would look at our family's history and see what he was becoming. He ran, and I finally understood. He read it. He just didn't care. The clip of Glosser's heartbroken testimonial was viewed nearly as many times as the walkout itself. Stephen Miller's career did not end with a formal resignation. It evaporated into a humiliating political non-existence. 6 months after the walkout, he was a ghost haunting the West Wing. While technically retaining the title of Deputy Chief of Staff, his portfolio had been surgically stripped bare. Immigration policy was quietly transferred to a newly established Border Security Council from which he was conspicuously excluded. Homeland Security matters now bypassed him entirely, directed straight to the Secretary. His office, once the intense nerve center of the administration's policy, became a mere bureaucratic pass-through for irrelevant paperwork. He had not conducted a public interview in 5 months, had not appeared at a press briefing in 6, and was entirely absent from any White House event photography since his theatrical exit. Sources within the administration described him as a shadow. He came to the office, sat alone, and departed, a figure who was here, but not here. The internal political consensus was absolute. Miller was toxic, a liability so severe that his presence alone destroyed any political cover for the policies he once championed. The number 648 remained the relentless anchor of his failure. A documentary film titled 648 premiered at Sundance, winning the Audience Award and dominating the cultural conversation. The film featured agonizing interviews with separated families, immigration lawyers, and centered on the figure of Dr. David S. Glosser, who, on camera, read his letter to his nephew aloud, breaking down as he delivered the line about the family's ancestors. Miller, predictably, declined all invitations to participate. The filmmakers included a damning title card. Stephen Miller was invited to tell his side of the story. He did not respond. Congress continued the ritual humiliation. Miller was subpoenaed 3 additional times, having no viable claim to refuse. He appeared, but only under siege, flanked by up to 5 layers of legal counsel, invoking executive privilege on virtually every substantive question. The subsequent hearings became less about new information and more about public performance. Other members of Congress often did not even need to question him directly. They would simply play the walkout clip on the floor and ask, with cold formality, "Mr. Miller, would you like to answer the question now?" He never did. The term, the Crockett treatment, entered the political lexicon, a new verb in political journalism. To be Crocketted meant to be so thoroughly, logically, and morally dismantled by a cross-examination that the witness was physically or psychologically compelled to flee the room. Reporters began asking other officials, "Are you prepared to be Crocketted?" Surviving her cross-examination became an unofficial badge of political honor. Miller's political viability was utterly terminated. There would be no cabinet position in a future administration, no powerful Senate run, and no return to influence. A Republican strategist told Axios the brutal truth: "You can recover from a lot in politics. You can't recover from running away on camera." That clip is his political obituary. It will follow him forever. His reported $2 million book deal for a memoir titled America First. My story was unceremoniously canceled by the conservative publisher, who issued a boilerplate statement about mutually agreeing to part ways. Industry sources confirmed the simple reason: nobody wanted to buy a book written by the man who ran away from his own story. The final, decisive blow to his legacy came 6 months to the day after his dramatic exit. The National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., opened a new exhibit dedicated to American immigration history. The display featured a section on Jewish refugees of the early 1900s, including a copy of the passenger manifest from the SS Molt, dated January 7, 1903, showing the names of Wolf Lieb Glosser and Bessie Glosser. Next to the manifest, a video screen played 2 clips on a continuous loop. The first was grainy historical footage of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, faces etched with hope and determination. The second was the viral, high-definition clip of Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff, pushing through the hearing room door, running from the question of whether he felt anything about his family's journey. The exhibit's title was The Final, devastating summation of Miller's life. They came with hope. What did their children do with it? Stephen Miller was invited to the opening. He did not attend. Jasmine Crockett did. She stood before the manifest, reading the names of Wolf Lieb and Bessie Glosser, the ancestors of a man whose legacy was now irrevocably etched in the stone of historical shame. A reporter asked her for a final thought. "I'm thinking about the 648 children who still can't find their parents," she responded, her voice measured. "I'm thinking about the 900 emails without a single kind word for an immigrant. And I'm thinking that Wolf Lieb Glosser crossed an entire ocean with $8 and never ran from anything." She looked directly at the looping video clip of Miller's flight. His great-great-grandson had all the power in the world, and he couldn't sit in a chair for 2 hours and face the truth. Some doors, once you run out of them, Mr. Miller, you can never walk back through. Stephen Miller ran because he had no answer, not because the question was hard, but because the truth, the weight of 648 lost children, 1 million annual arrests, 900 hateful emails, and a profound betrayal of his family's survival, was too heavy to bear. He felt enough to flee, and in that flight, he sealed his own destruction. The line of those waiting to face Jasmine Crockett, the Texas attorney who did not flinch, was still very, very long, and after Stephen Miller, that line had never been more nervous.